Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Hope you can see me all okay. I can't see my own camera, so hopefully it's working okay. Welcome to the next webinar in our Productivity Insights Network webinar series, Thinking and Acting Differently Post-COVID-19. And this is really to support the launch of Productivity Insights Network's second book, Productivity and the Pandemic. We've got excellent speakers for you today who will briefly give an overview of their chapter within the book. We'll run through the presentations first and then have questions and answers at the end, and hopefully a good discussion. If you do have any points, can you please put them in the question and answers, and I'll do my best to work through them when we can. Okay, first of all, just a little bit about the Productivity Insights Network. If you can change slide, Kat. Possible, thank you very much. The Productivity Insights Network was established now almost 3 years ago and is funded through the Economic and Social Research Council. We are a range of universities and private sector companies as well, and I'm from the University of Sunderland, and we're a multidisciplinary network looking at productivity from a social science perspective. And the tagline there is very important, and I actually feel quite proud that we've done that. And it's to change, our aim is to change the tone of the debate, of the productivity debate in theory and practice. So we've got a good range of topics today. Okay, so before going to the speakers, I'll very briefly just say something about some other work the Productivity Insights Network have been involved on. Oh, before we do, you can buy, yeah, we can come back to that in a moment. Yeah, you can buy a copy of the book and we can give details as well. So don't worry, the seminar will be recorded so you can look at that as well. So in terms of other work that I've been involved with through the Productivity Insights Network, my name's Lisa McSorley and I'm based here at the University of Sunderland. And for the past 6 months, I've been working on a project with the Government Office for Science on rebuilding a resilient Britain. And that really brought together academics, funders and policymakers to really try to identify the medium and longer term areas of research interest. And I chaired a subgroup on productivity, business and national economy. And I've put up the website, the Productivity Insights Network.co.uk, and that is the address for the blog there that can give you more information. Essentially, I looked at productivity from a micro, meso and macro perspective and really identified gaps in current research in policy and practice and provided some recommendations there. So in terms of productivity, at a micro level, productivity and employment, those regional to macro economic transitions in terms of structural inequalities, which I think there's still quite significant gaps in our research, really looking at those drivers of productivity in the labour market and labour market inequality, environmental sustainability, international best practice, and often I think an area that's overlooked is theoretical underpinnings of productivity. I think there's a lot of policymakers in the audience today, and I think with business leaders, there's a pressure to deliver on productivity, but I think we do need to go back a step and actually look at some of the theory underpinning our productivity research. So I'll go on with that. The main conclusion from the report is that there's a widening gap between theory, data, policy and practice when it comes to UK productivity. And this book, Productivity and the Pandemic, goes a good way to really starting the conversation. But I think, as we know, that the pandemic has really not just changed the economic fundamentals, it's very much moved the floor in terms of where we're starting. So I would say it's very much new productivity challenges, new productivity opportunities. And for the researchers and policymakers in the audience, we need to recognise that and adjust our strategies accordingly. Okay, so I'll briefly move on, thank you, and introduce the speakers. But as I said, you can look up the Rebuilding a Resilient initiative on the Productivity Insights blog, and also the report is on the University Policies Engagement Network, upenn.ac.uk/go_science, and you can access all 9 reports there that may be of use. There's lots of good links that are available. Okay, so I'll continue on and introduce our speakers today. Thank you very much. So first of all, our first speaker is Dr. Jen Nellis, and she'll be speaking about her chapter in the book based on work that she's done with other colleagues, including Professor Tim Vorley, who's here and will be assisting with the question and answers. And Jen is looking at her chapter, From Systems Change to Systems Changed, Assuming a Systems-Based Approach in Response to the Crisis. So I'll hand over to Jen.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me, or actually kind of not having me there today because I'm doing this pre-recorded. And since it's about 4 a.m. in New York, by the time you probably get around to seeing this live, I'm actually doing this from my sleep. So I don't know, that's pretty cool, and a bit of a life achievement unlocked. But I'm not alone. One or both of my collaborators, Adam Brown or Tim Vorley, are probably around, or should be, and should be about to answer questions, aka do the hard stuff in this presentation. So feel free to fire any questions at them or comments while I prattle on. To business. Our chapter focuses on how systems thinking as a different lens could change our perspectives on productivity as we look towards recovery. And we look at what policy responses maybe should look like when you adopt that point of view. In the short time that I have, I'm going to try my best to introduce systems thinking and highlight how we might use it to tackle recovery and to build resilience post-COVID. This advice we think that the advice that we're giving here is pretty useful anytime, but argue that it's particularly relevant in times of crisis like we're in right now, where analysis based on things that have worked in the past might no longer hold. The rules of the games are changing, and learning-led approaches might be more appropriate, more effective. Anyway, that's one of our theses in this presentation. So just a quick intro here about what systems thinking is and why we think it matters. To us, system thinking is a set of tools and a framework for exploring problem spaces as parts of complex adaptive systems. This point of view really appreciates that much of the social world in which we operate consists of systems, that is social structures, structures of actors, relationships, and rules characterized by complexity. Things like the economy are complex systems in this perspective. Systems are more than just complicated. When we use the word complexity, that's very, very deliberate. It means something specific or a group of specific things. It's a term to use to describe systemic attributes, such as the interdependence between elements, nonlinear dynamics, emergent behavior, and path dependence, among a bunch of other things. And I'm going to get into some of that today, and we've covered it elsewhere as well as in the chapter. In short, this approach views problem spaces as embedded in broader context and specifically seeks to explain observed outcomes by searching out those interdependencies, interactions, feedback loops, and sources of interference in order to better design and experiment with policy. We think that this approach is particularly advantageous now, and that's the point we make in the chapter, where relationships or trend-based analysis will often work in times of stability, sort of normal times, but in times of shock or crisis, those relationships and patterns tend to break down. So a systems approach is actually better suited to help predict how relationships will change and where trends might go next. It also, kind of provides a bit of a toolkit to think through how to adapt and understand what's happening. So a little bit here more about what complex systems specifically are. This diagram on the right is one representation, like a very, very simplified representation of a complex system that illustrates a couple of the principles that we want to highlight. We're not going to be able to cover everything, but we can kind of get at a couple of things here. And one thing I find really useful is to contrast what you're seeing here with some of the policy models that you might be used to seeing, where there's sort of one central goal and a bunch of arrows just sort of pointing at that central goal. Everything's the same size, everything's pointing towards the center. There's no kind of connection between the elements that are, we often call factors or pillars or drivers. And those are things that you are probably used to seeing in policy documents. This gets at some of the same ideas, like we're really still trying to understand what's driving processes, but it does it in a very different way. Here, the system that we're looking at is, and all complex systems are, they're basically chains of very simple relationships. You can look at any one of the connections of the arrows. They're in isolation, but it's really important to note that any one of those things may have more than one connection and have multiple effects as well. Looking at chains of these relationships reveals really important effects when you start to look at all of how they all sort of work together. Feedback loops that can reinforce and amplify effects, or that can be balancing, so that can kind of keep things in check. And those are really important elements of complex systems. Combinations of these form subsystems that you can, to a certain degree, think of as their own thing. While it's obviously still understanding that they don't exist in isolation. And multiple interacting subsystems, as you kind of see here, there's kind of two of those, form a complex system. As a result of these complex structures, systems have some interesting, sometimes surprising and really important characteristics that are critical for theory and practice. We're listing a couple here. There are many more, but we just wanted to highlight these ones. Emergence is when unanticipated results can happen further down the chain as a result of feedback loops and the behaviors of subsystems. These can amplify small effects, dampen large interventions, or cause all sorts of unexpected outcomes and chaos if you're not careful. Punctuated equilibria is sort of refers to the myth that systems are actually usually in equilibrium. They're not. They exhibit a lot of dynamism and move around quite a bit, including sudden changes related to shocks. Those changes don't always mean that a system is failing or broken, but can sometimes indicate that. So it's important to keep an eye out on what exactly we're seeing in these moments of punctuated equilibrium. Path dependence is a term you're mostly probably familiar with, which simply means that systems have memory. That's useful to know and can help guide policy to a certain degree, but might not hold in periods of crisis, particularly systemic crisis. All of these nonlinear dynamics mean that systems don't behave the way policymakers think they should sometimes. And again, that's true in normal conditions all the time, right? We still struggle with that, but it's even more so when we try to apply old logics to change systems, which is what happens in times of crisis. We, and system scholars more generally, present systems thinking not a set of solutions, but a set of tools, ways of perceiving the world that's more sensitive and can adapt to this type of complexity. We also think that there are real risks inherent in not adopting this approach, and some of these are obvious, but some others are not. I'm going to run through these. I wish I had time for some more examples, but we'll just do this quick. First, obviously, the failure to see problems as embedded in broader systems means that we might be making decisions based on flawed assumptions, and we might miss fundamental connections, not just in terms of primary relationships, but also across chains of relationships and subsystems. More linear ways of thinking about policy tend to favor and encourage siloed thinking, which in turn makes it a lot more difficult to think things through from a system perspective. So those silos can be really problematic and blind spots. So that encourages everyone to kind of work away in their own thematic areas and assume that successes will result when that might not be the case. It also tends to encourage people to focus on short-term solutions without thinking through longer-term implications. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why that would happen anyway, not just not thinking in terms of systems, but an important element of the system structure is that the impacts of actions and interventions are not always immediate. So something that looks like it's working initially can create benefits that can be wiped out by effects further down the chain as those sort of lagged influences are felt. A good example of this is how you can't build your way out of traffic congestion. Adding more lanes alleviates the problem shifts incentives such that congestion just returns anyway. And so that's a really classic example of that. That same example illustrates how we can tend to focus on the symptoms and not really think about causes when we're not applying systems thinking. In this case, congestion is a symptom. The cause is not enough lanes on the highway. So it's important to think through that, trace through the causes. When you're thinking in terms of systems, you actually are more likely to do that because you're trying to understand the chains and the feedbacks that are happening. Last one with this list is that we assume that what works at one scale might work at another. For instance, skills policies that work to increase talent at a national scale don't have the same effect when applied locally or regionally because people are more mobile internally than they are internationally, and all sorts of leakage can happen under those conditions. And so that's an interesting example. Okay, so what? Well, I think there are a couple of lessons that we can take away from all of this as to how we can adopt systems thinking in practice. First, though, we want to acknowledge that we are not the only ones who have thought about this. We're not visionaries. We didn't just come up with this out of nowhere. There are lots of people working on this in scholarship and in practice. So we just want to shout that out. There are also people in government that are actually using these principles to build awesome models and applying them through policy. But our point is that I think we benefit if everybody adopted this outlook, if everyone understood the value of systems thinking. And really what that involves is, among other things, avoiding this temptation to, use simplistic interpretations and analysis. Obviously be simple in how we're communicating about things and effective, but when it comes to understanding the problem and intervening, know that it's a complex system and treat it as such. That means recognizing the uses and limitations of trend-based evidence. So that means that what has worked in the past, all of the models that used to hold might not hold anymore. And it's really important to go hunting for the reasons for that and not to assume that more of the same is going to get you where you want to go. We also need to acknowledge scale or spatial organizational timescale variations. What works in one place doesn't always work in another one. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. And that's really, really, really important in trying, really have to understand how to interpret feedback in order to be effective like that. Again, look out for feedback effects, positive and negative. And I think that's a really important point. Feedback effects can be leveraged. They can be used to your advantage. So it's not just looking out for feedback effects that might be balancing loops that are dampening your policy interventions, but also looking for the points where you can make small changes that will then be reinforced throughout the system in order to get where you want to go. So they can be your friends, these feedback effects, but they can also get in your way. And the last thing here is that you should learn to dance with problems. This isn't about solving problems within complex systems. It's much more important to be agile, to adapt, to again learn how to read feedback and respond appropriately. So that's what we've got for today. I think our main point is that this is a particularly important moment, and looking towards recovery, looking towards a life post-COVID, hopefully soon, and that the systems approach might help us think through what to expect, where to go next with productivity policy, and to try and institute some changes in how we think about policy that will be durable and effective, even as we're no longer responding to this particular crisis. Thank you very much. Fire any questions you have at my co-authors, and have a great rest of the seminar.
Okay, thank you, Jen. And that was excellent. And we'll come back to the question and answers. I'll hand over now to Professor Duncan McLennan and Jin Kao Long from the University of Glasgow, who'll be looking at productivity and housing. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Hi, thank you. First, thanks for including our chapter into this webinar. Our paper introduced how housing is connected to productivity and thus make better economic cases for housing. I will introduce the rationale and the concept framework, then followed by Duncan. In the economy policy sphere, housing has long been regarded as a significant component of consumption and investments, with large multiplier effects on GDP and employment. In addition, housing also accounts for the largest share of net worth for a typical household, ranging from 17% in Slovak Republic to 25% in Germany. Improvement in housing becomes widely believed to be associated with many external social and economic benefits. However, the effect of housing on economic growth and productivity growth still need to be verified and acknowledged. The relationship between housing and productivity has been well established in the context of Australia, and we have almost finished the literature review and the concept framework for Australia. Thus, we hope to establish this link in the context of UK. Housing is understood to be a form of spatially fixed, materially realized capital expenditure, the provision of which enables the delivery of economic and productivity outcomes or essential services. It also has multiple attributes such as price, size, tenure, locations, etc. We support that housing characteristics and processes impacts growth drivers via agglomeration, economies, inelasticity effects, and externality effects. In this context, we include housing development, consumption, and human capital formation and labor markets, business growth, and innovation into the categories of growth drivers. Housing characteristics and processes could positively or negatively, directly or indirectly influence these growth drivers. Of course, housing systems and their outcomes may differ considerably across regions and within nations. So yeah, that's me. Lex, Duncan, please.
Hi, thanks, Juncha. I think essentially Juncha is saying that when we've looked at issues about housing, we haven't really thought about productivity at any system level, individual, metro, or macro. And at the macro scale, attempts in the conventional economic framework to estimate the productivity or output elasticity effects of capital investment have either not been done for housing, or they've been done in such a way that by and large the results have not been credible. But in terms of a lot of policy thinking, in general, housing doesn't feature centrally or hasn't featured centrally in economic debates about productivity. Now, why we think that it's important that we do begin to look at this in more detail, and what our PIN project explored was the complexity of the outcomes. Of course, impacts a whole range of market and public sector outcomes, but in fact, that complexity is not mirrored in the way that policy, nor indeed planning, actually looks at the issue, and that's the nub of this presentation. In other words, the siloism that there has been in academic research on housing is reflected very quickly in a kind of siloed perspective in relation to what housing does at local scales. And that these silos are reflected in professional practice and training. People that do courses in economic development, local economic development, don't really do work about housing and productivity. Planners are just verging onto it now because everyone's laying the blame for house price inflation at their doors. And people that mainly do housing just think about the social dimensions. So this way has been reflected in how we study this, how we talk about it, and how it's designed in policy. in the PIN interviews, when we went and talked to people in 5 different metropolitan areas in the UK, similar to a study I'd previously done in Australia, people in housing say, housing in the economy and productivity. No, we don't do that. Go away. We've got a shitload of housing needs problems to deal with. Go and talk to somebody else. Sorry about the terminology, but that's basically what they say. Go to local economic development and they'll say, no, we're about innovation. We're about human capital. Housing, that's people in housing that do it. And if you go and talk to the people in planning, they neither think about the economy in terms of what drives the outcomes, nor do they economically evaluate the plans and strategies they produce. So the problem falls out of the way we've traditionally not only done research, but done policy. Now, why do we think it's really important? Because the housing choices, spatial choices that people make, reflect their interactions with labour markets, whether or not they're concentrated in disadvantaged areas, whether they're near to zones of high employment density and potential agglomeration and productivity effects. If there's poor quality housing, we know that kids that don't start off life well in their early education, their human capital is attenuated further down. And everyone will espouse in general terms when we would push people in economic development offices to talk about this, or academics who aren't housing economists to talk about it. They'd say, yeah, these things are important, but it's not what we do. This is really important, and it is becoming more important for a couple of reasons. The first would be that actually in the last 20 years, the powerful productivity bonus there has been from being in a large metropolitan area has systematically eroded. In other words, large cities are regressing towards the mean. And I think that is a lot to do with what broadly defined congestion effects. For instance, excess demand for housing, no supply response, people driven further away from their workplace, spend longer times commute. That's not just a transport problem, although in Britain we solve it by building more roads and more railways. We don't think better about linking housing and transportation. That's slightly unfair. I think in the last 2 or 3 years, things have become a little better. But that failure to think in system terms is actually really costing in terms of congestion and outcomes. And it's not just housing tenure choices. That obviously influences how people spend their money or macro patterns of investment. We've actually, in broad terms, if you go to the macro level, created a housing system that rewards people more often for lying in their beds, sleeping, as John Stuart Mill did, rather than working, or indeed investing. In other words, the nature of the housing price outcomes drive huge implications, not just for patterns of where we live, but where we invest and how we use the homes we have. When we get to COVID, and I have to say, our empirical work in this, of course, is all post the PIN project, but we've been doing a big piece of work in Australia on the major Australian cities, largely for the reason that I'm actually speaking to from Canada, and I like to go to Australia in the Canadian winter. But also because they offer you money much more readily than the ESRC. So we've been doing our work on Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane rather than London, Edinburgh, or Manchester. And I think these issues are really important in the UK. In terms of COVID effects, COVID has unburied, if you like, all the housing separation problems, both in terms of its incidence and its potential scarring effects. So all the neighbourhood effects that are related to housing market concentrations on human capital are going to come back with a vengeance starting in about 6 months' time. So that effect is in place and strong. There's the fact that COVID has really speeded up, I think, obviously patterns of working from home, therefore home is at the centre of the discussion. Is your broadband well connected? Mine isn't actually, but it's behaving reasonably well this morning. What about people who don't have space in their home to work from home? What about the issues about being able to actually work at home rather than spend time commuting with a productivity effect. And it's raising, again, in the UK and Australia and Canada, where we're researching on this, there are early signs of a significant dispersal of people to well-connected towns and rural areas close to major metropolitan areas. It's reinforced the effect of the pressures of the last 10 years. Will that, in a sense, further complicate agglomeration effects is an interesting thing. It may well be there are productivity gains in the short time, people spending more time at home, but do the face-to-face contacts begin to matter after 2 or 3 years of people working from home? In other words, there are issues and feedback effects that need to be thought about in that particular context. So I think that going back to the question of agglomeration economies, it pays all in there. Really critical in this is there'll be big infrastructure programs as part of building back better. Transport almost makes a better case because they slap a productivity gain case on the table, whereas housing still seems to get redistribution towards poor people or aspiring first-time buyers. So the productivity argument isn't on the debate yet in the UK. It is in some other settings. It needs to be. The conversation needs to strengthen in that regard. This is actually the first time we've talked about our ESRC project in a kind of wider UK context, but we think that it will be really, housing is going to be a big part of the attempt to bridge the gap between surplus savings and low aggregate demand. And in that context, much better thinking about the way in which we design and locate housing to boost productivity is a significant consideration, not just in the big metropolitan areas, but in rural settings as well. So thank you. And we greatly enjoyed the project. And Julie Mao, who's in Melbourne now, and Linda Christie contributed to this work. I should say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan and Junko. That was fascinating and gave a really practical insight following on from Jen's call for the need for systems thinking. I think housing and productivity is an excellent example of where the research needs to be going. Now, the next presentation is exciting. We've got Professor Felix Ritchie, University of the West of England, talking about the power of administrative data, and this is new and exciting area for researchers. So I'll hand over to Felix. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. It's so new and exciting. We're only at the early stages of putting our results together, so I'm not going to talk about results, but I'm talk about where we want to be. This is a paper with a number of authors on there, so thank you to them for letting me present this, particularly to Lizzie Wayne at ADI UK, who is the primary author of this paper. So I'm talking about administrative data. What we mean by administrative data is data created from interactions with service users rather than being collected as a particular purpose. So the big advantage of this is universality, at least for those using the service. So for example, information from HMRC's data systems involves everyone who's paid tax, unlike say an ONS survey on earnings, which only includes those people who are included in the survey. It's also good for timeliness, because the information is collected to do something with it, and so it's often available very quickly, and there's a small additional cost of the data collection. Disadvantages is that by its nature, it comes from people interacting with organizations and with their services, so sometimes we don't know about non-users. For example, we might not know about people in the informal economy. The data is also collected for a particular purpose, which means it might not be relevant to what we want to do with the data. And we'd often quite like to link the data. Now, this is often possible because the information contains lots of information about people, but this might not be allowed because of the way that the data is being collected. But generally, across government services, this is a general trend towards greater movement of administrative data. We recognize the power of it. and the limitations or the problems with it are things which we're trying to overcome. So why is this relevant to productivity? Well, productivity at its simplest is outputs versus inputs. And those are the two things we want to measure. So let's think about the human input. Now, how much does it cost? How does time at work relate to health? We've got surveys to cover this, but we also know that, for example, these can be poor at missing particular areas, for example, in the low paid sector, in precarious work, in the gig economy. These are all really difficult to understand, and as are quite often areas where there are significant productivity problems, it's important. We'll take another example. Some of my co-authors work on farming data. Now, most farms are small, they're family businesses. They have quite low productivity on traditional economic measures of what counts as productive, but that's because they also have a very high interaction with the environment. So it's quite difficult to pull all this information together in surveys and get both the coverage and the detail that you want. So putting our admin data together, that can allow us to bring together some of the coverage, and if linked, does make it possible for us to look at these different elements together in a way that we're not reduced by finding overlapping samples in surveys. So why is this relevant to the pandemic? Well, there are two things that we need to know to understand the pandemic. First of all, where are we now? And secondly, what's going to happen next? So admin data is really good at the real-time info in general, about knowing where we are. Particularly here, the pandemic has seen massive government intervention in many different fields. So this manifests itself in administrative data. So we can see, for example, the furlough schemes in the HMRC data. We can see the business loan schemes in the Bank of England's data. We can see how it's being applied and who to. We can also look at things like shielding activity, family circumstances that's in the benefits data. We can use information from the health service to try and understand how people are responding to having to work at home and the mental health effects of that. So we've got quite a lot of information which is telling us what's happening now. And because it's administrative data, it's collected to do something, it's available quite quickly. The other element, though, is we want to know what happens next, where are we going? And to do this, we really need to understand what is normal, what will be like in normal situations, so that we can understand things that are happening at the moment. What's the next thing that's going to appear? And for this, what we really need is long time series. We need to understand things like, well, what's happened in the past that looks like this? How has this changed? For example, think about going back sort of 10 years or so, there was the foot and mouth crisis in agriculture. How did the farming industry respond to that? How resilient was the farming industry? And again, what we get out of that is a lot of the information about trying to find information, what support mechanisms were in place, what information did the government collect at that time that can help teach us about how we might respond to this time. This is also where we get the benefits of really from linking data from multiple sources. And this is also where we can really use linking administrative data with purposely collected data, because our purposely collected data, for example, the surveys from ONS, are there to address some of the conceptual issues which we really want to answer. But I say, we don't necessarily have the coverage from there. They're often quite slow to appear, although the COVID survey is a particularly good example of how quickly you can respond if you need to. But putting all this information together, this gives us a much better sense of both, what's happening now, that's our immediate administrative effect, but what do we think is going to happen? What do we know, for example, about people who are on low paid work who lose their jobs? What's the long-term effect of that? Now, the pandemic is different, but what we can at least try and understand is, okay, in the past, this is what's happened. If you had a period of unemployment, period of low paid work, does that lead to a scarring effect? Okay, we think that's going to be the same here when there's a very widespread scarring effect, but it's very concentrated in particular sectors. So these are things which we're trying to understand by putting together various different types of information at the sources. So lastly, what have we learned from the pandemic? Well, it's been very good for highlighting the value of admin data. Because of the need to get information and understand what's happening, this has broken down a lot of the barriers. With my other hat on, working as an advisor on data governance and data access rather than as an economic researcher, I've seen the way that people have responded to the need for information and recognize the value of this. And we focused much more on the benefits of being able to access this information and realize that perhaps sometimes if we shared this information, the world hasn't ended. So we are lowering the barriers, and it has moved towards greater use of data. For example, we're currently negotiating with HMRC about the possibility of getting access to their furlough information to link it to ONS's information on earnings. That's something that 18 months ago was just completely off the table. So it's a long way to go. But the one thing we have got out of the pandemic is we've highlighted a lot more the benefits and how we can manage those risks a lot more effectively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felix. That's great. Just in terms of the opportunities in terms of administrative data, but as you rightly said, how to minimise the risks as well. So I'm sure we'll come back to that in discussion. Thank you. Our final speaker is Richard Whittle, Dr. Richard Whittle from Manchester Metropolitan University, and he'll be talking on the implications of a crisis-driven societal shift to online consumption. So again, very relevant at the moment. So hand over to Richard. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So this chapter, written with Stuart Mills at the LSE and Gavin at the University of Liverpool, really does start to look at how we as a workforce, as a society, as an economy have kind of shifted to a digital by default economic model. And it talks a little bit about the longevity of that as well, but some of the policy implications. But I think the thing to kind of emphasize of why it's so important for looking at kind of productivity is that the policy impact of this. So the chapter itself was written whilst a project was ongoing that I'm involved with Manchester City Council, which is the direct provision of IT equipment, laptops or data to people who have often been made unemployed or something around the pandemic with a variety of other eligibility criteria. Now that project, which kind of involved kind of some of the, as per some of the other kind of speakers, it involved some of the housing departments, it involved some of the skills size, it involved some of the inequality teams as well, bringing it all together to look at something very, very tangible in a kind of help and productivity sphere. And one of the things that just kind of occurred to me whilst we're talking about housing is that I think this is actually an example of where kind of housing have been very involved, looking at the design, the connectivity issues of kind of broadband and 5G within social housing as well. And actually some of the housing departments funded quite a lot of the project. Now, the digital inclusion is a really worthy policy consideration before the pandemic. The digitally excluded have really struggled to be involved with the economy. There's a variety of useful and insightful research, some from the ONS, some coming out very, very recently, about the disadvantages of not being able to join in with the online economy. But since the pandemic, we've really seen this was being called a digital revolution again since the first lockdown, where services, health services, welfare services, social services, social entertainment, and the economy really has just shifted online. So a couple of key and kind of illuminating examples. Within the first 6 weeks after the first lockdown, more people made the shift to online banking than had done in the preceding 12 years. As part of the project, we're talking to a variety of different business owners, and one very powerful quote, which was, we have done our next 10 years digital transformation in the last 12 weeks, including bringing on websites, payment systems, everything along those lines. The ONS in 2019, so pre-COVID, demonstrated that online shopping on average was about 14–15% cheaper. At the same time, access to services were more streamlined. A couple of brilliant papers point out health effects, health inequality effects of not being able to access services online. This was pre-COVID as well. and parts of not being able to access particular employment and employment training, which is available online as well. So people not being able to access these systems were kind of key relevance pre-COVID and are now kind of the utmost importance. People have been describing it as a human rights crisis, the invisible crisis behind COVID of digital inclusion. And based on some of the kind of research that was kind of co-entwined into this project, we decided to actually try to do something tangible. We, through various organisations, obtained funding to deliver around 500 devices and a variety of data provisions, people who already had devices but couldn't afford to access the internet. So I'm bringing this up because I think it's a real direct and traceable impact of the productivity research that's going on at the moment. But I also think that the research and the actual policy is really going on rapidly, whereas some of the dangers are still not being explored. And that's what the chapter also focuses on, the dangers of digital naivety and the dangers of thinking of digital inclusion just as access. So the ONS point out quite rightly that digital inclusion needs to go past just access to online, but actually be able to confidently manage and navigate the online space as well. And that's both in some of the national policy pushes to get people connected for education, to facilitate access. The second part of that is actually being forgotten a little bit, the skills, the confidence to operate safely in the digital sphere. So we start to see, with following the lockdown, following that digital revolution, a corresponding rise in cybercrime. In fact, some of the research suggests that incidents of cybercrime are around 20 times higher than they were pre-pandemic. We see huge incidences as well of kind of lower level, but incredibly impactful on an individual basis, social cyber harm, so bullying, things along those lines, have really increased as well. And at the same time, we're seeing this big change in people's spending patterns. So as we all on this call probably know, we're not really using cash anymore. We switched to a cashless form of consumption. In fact, the FCA, our financial regulator in the UK, is currently consulting on raising the contactless limit from £30, which it was, it's now £45, to what's being proposed of £100. And we can start to see how people's behaviours are changing. So quite an old study now, kind of 2016, again pre-pandemic, that looked at how people's spending behaviours changed as soon as they used contactless for the first time. Over the year, they tended to spend an extra 30% on luxuries. They tended to also change their spending behaviours, so they were more susceptible to taking on subscriptions, to kind of going into the automatic, not really thinking about the payments of what they were doing. We also saw that a couple of brilliant experimental studies have demonstrated that when people are using contactless, they are prepared to pay up to twice as much for the same goods as if when they were using cash. And all of this points to a picture where we've got policy, which is very tangible, very useful, helping people get online in terms of the access, but actually not offering the protections for the individual operating in this digital sphere. And you can see that on the time, so I'll just make the last point very, very quickly. What we're also seeing is an acceleration of trend, towards a digital by default economy. It was already there pre-COVID. This has exacerbated it, it's sped it up, but as it's an ongoing trend, we don't expect a snapback. And certainly the empirical evidence that's in the chapter suggests that after the first lockdown, with the kind of relaxed summer period last year, what we didn't see was this snapback to physical consumption. We saw a snapback in hospitality, because presumably of the availability then of it, but we certainly didn't see the snapback in banking services, in online shopping, those kind of things as well. So there's some really valuable policy program, digital inclusion, and the chapter has then helped inform this project that's going on at the moment. But as we start operating more and more online, we change our behaviours, potentially allowing or facilitating greater harm in terms of spending, indebtedness, and a variety of different cyber effects. And I suppose lastly, we're not expecting a snapback to a pre-COVID level of physicality in consumption. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was really interesting and lots for us to think about as well. We're due to finish at 10 o'clock, so if anyone needs to go, that's okay. It's recorded. However, we'll take some of the questions just now. So if the panelists are happy to continue on, I think that should be okay for a few moments. First of all, Richard, as you kind of just finished, I think one of the questions, I think that's a good point in terms of gets to the heart of the productivity debate. And that's, if you like, productivity for whom or who benefits. And I think that's, true in terms of, I like the phrase digital by default. So just in terms of, we're operating in a crisis situation, and that's very different, if you like, to free choice in terms of, how we consume. How do you think then, do we need to start thinking, say, policymakers will be interested in thinking about how then can we really prioritise digital inclusion? What really should we be focused on? Does your book chapter touch on any of those issues?
It doesn't really, as it came out slightly before the project's still ongoing. But taking insights from that and the chapter, the one thing, and I think it's kind of again links back to some of the other talks, the thing that's enabled the projects which so far has been very, very successful that I'm talking about in Manchester is a lack of red tape due to an urgency of COVID. Now that's enabled access to data from numerous different teams to able to target people who would most benefit from the kind of limited resource of provision of this. It's also broken down some of the type silos between teams. So it's brought in housing, it's brought in skills, it's brought in development, and all together onto, well, say, table one big Zoom call to kind of get through this. And because of the urgency and kind of press support as well, of course, we can see it through the schooling, etc. It's actually been seen as quite a tangible way of helping the crisis, but bringing in kind of leaders, bringing in people at all levels within the authority as well. So this project, I think, is valuable and quite a clear example of something working well, partially because the trust that's been given to people to kind of facilitate their own digital inclusion. However, as per several of the older examples pre-COVID, the certainly examples in the States as well, once these things are scaled up and the kind of bespoke local knowledge and the bespoke willingness disappears somewhat, then you end up with a system that actually probably doesn't work. So with this project, it's been really targeted in working with housing authorities as well to really target people, say, data provision and connectivity issues. However, once that's done on a larger scale, probably anything more than a city level scale, it suddenly becomes much more difficult to kind of get that joined up level of information and thinking. So I think that these projects are good, but they're probably most effective at a local level.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Richard. And I think that's the issue, that local knowledge and the scale. And that's something that Jen touched on. Tim, I don't know if you want to say, we've had a question in, is that obviously, policymakers are keen in terms of the systems approach seems the right approach. We are talking about the various different aspects of productivity. How do we start to actually join them up? I know Jen's presentation was quite conceptual, but I know you've done work, say, in Northern Ireland, actually looking at policy in other areas. So just how can we start to convince policymakers, or where's the entry point to systems analysis? How do they start thinking like this?
Yeah, I think it's a good and difficult question, and it kind of relates and brings together, I guess, some of the points that the other speakers have made this morning. So the work that we've done in Northern Ireland and that we're continuing to do with government centrally in the UK, first of all, I think it's to say that there is an appetite for this. There's lots of talk about it, but I think that there is a perception that it's difficult to do, and that the existing structures and ways of working kind of represent barriers to potentially implementing and invoking that systems approach. With Jen and with Adam Brown as well, some of the work that they particularly have kind of been leading on, looking at some of the challenges around the innovation ecosystem in the Northwest. I think that what we can begin to see there is that the case of moving towards a systems-based approach is something where actually it's trying to understand where those intersections are and the interdependencies between what would otherwise be the silos of working and how they can be supported. Jen mentioned in the presentation the feedback loops, and it's really trying to kind of understand how those different subsystems relate. I think that the point that Jen made is that we're not trying to advocate for something here that is one meta system, but rather trying to understand what are the subsystems, how do they operate, where are their points of interdependence, and by really focusing on some of those interdependencies and understanding the feedback loops, that we can get some really kind of strong outcomes, which isn't a case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. It is much more about looking at where there are opportunities to iterate and improve on the existing and prevailing ways of working.
Thanks, Tim. I'll bring Felix in and then go back to Duncan and Jinkao. Felix, I suppose maybe in this period, there's been a real pressure for data-driven research. And I think the administrative data is opportunity to link a lot of these domains. I suppose, how can we do that in a way that responds to policymakers but minimises those risks of, if you like, building in assumptions or building in bias? If you're linking lots of different data sets, you need to analyse that. So that's my concern, that it's not just data, it is actually analysis of that. So in terms of administrative data and your experience, you know, how can we try to reconcile that?
That's a very good point. I mean, there are two issues here. One is about generally being able to share data and reuse it. And I think this is where COVID has been important, because traditionally, particularly in government, people have tended to say, can we share this data? Well, if we do, what do we get out of this? And if we don't, well, that's someone else's problem. And that's very much skewed the decision-making towards let's not do this and not take the risk. Now, COVID has been very clear, saying, if you don't do this, this is the risk. People will die, people will lose their jobs. It's very clear you need to cooperate with this. So I think that's been a very strong move, and it needed something like this to actually show how we can perhaps refocus our attention on this. That does lead potentially to governance problems, because we could start sharing data and thinking, oh, well, let's just do this, get this solved, and forget about the ethics of this. But I think we particularly in the UK, have pretty good systems amongst government for trying to identify this. But there is a third issue underlying that, which I think you were alluding to, is that we can hoover up all this data. What about the ones who are not included on this? You know, starting that there's quite a concern that the data might be focused on particular groups. For example, Richard talked about the digitally included. Great, we can find out loads about them. What about the people who don't have broadband access? How on earth do we understand what's happening to them? And so there is a potential risk, ironically, of having so much data that we think we cover everything, and potentially we haven't. And when you're doing surveys, for example, it's easy to see this is who we're picking up, this is who we think we're missing. When you're dealing with admin data, sometimes you can forget that not everyone interacts with that data. So we do need to keep this in mind.
Yeah, thank you, Felix. That's fascinating. As we say, I think that's important, and something I've flagged up with my work with the Government Office for Science is those people we don't pick up, those people, you know, who don't get a seat at the table, and making sure that we consider those needs as well. I think the big thing you mentioned is that risk, that balance, you know, of actually minimising the downside risks of all of that. So Duncan and Giancarlo, you talked, in terms of the complexity of housing, and I liked Duncan's term, the congestion effects, essentially the diseconomies of scale. I think we're very bad at actually measuring the downside risks of policy. So I think in policy formulation, our thinking is always optimal policy, the best policy. Duncan, in terms of housing, can you think of a way, in terms of your research, that we actually, if you like, need a stable policy? Is that better than optimal? And how do we go about that in terms of housing? I suppose a policy that minimises the risks or the downsides and more.
Well, I think that there have been dimensions of housing and monetary policy that have taken that approach, not least because housing played such a big part in financial instability last time around. You could argue that a properly constructed housing policy in terms of cost and quality of housing would minimise the risk of instability for households and families. So there are instability and effects in there. I think that in relation to the productivity effects, I mean, I've been doing this quite a long time and interested in city economic development generally, as well as specifically in housing, and seen just two parallel conversations. I actually sit on things like the Glasgow Economic Commission, and they are just separated conversations unless I keep butting in and say, look, you've got to join that up. And it's hard work because people come into the thing with a non-systemic perspective. So in terms of, I think we could have a much more productive housing system that would be more stable if a government actually concentrated on keeping rising housing costs. In other words, dealing with the issue about constant house price increases. But one side of the government might want to do that, but the other side of the government wants to say, hey, house prices are rising, everyone feels good. So that there's a really big contradiction in there. But I think in terms of performance of the UK economy and the metropolitan economies, just the lack of attention over 40 years to the question of what rising house prices do to not just housing affordability and that bit of the system, not just to wealth redistribution and that bit of the system, but to the productivity effects that have been consequential. So I'm sorry I've overgeneralized the answer, Lisa, but I think we could have a much more effective and productive housing system if we actually configured the system so that we invested in productive investment rather than the wrong-to sector of the economy.
I think that's a great answer, Duncan, and I think the fact you've so spot on identified the importance of housing to the financial crisis 2007-8 is crucial. I was working as an economist for Experian at that point, and we could see the housing bubble about to burst, but we didn't know the systemic knock-on. We didn't know the credit crunch would have become the global economic recession. So I think it would start to think about housing in other forms, as you rightly said, financial policy, fiscal policy, and the importance that that's true. Giancarlo, I don't know if you want to say anything maybe about the approach to housing in Australia. Do you have any thoughts on how that seems to be more readily discussed or accepted? No, okay, no problem. That's great, thank you. And they said you can read in terms of the chapter as well in the book. It's very detailed, and I think as well that's something we do need to think about, that international comparison as well. So that's really helpful way to think about it. Again, just conscious of time, so I think just check the questions. Yeah, I suppose just in terms of maybe vulnerable sectors. So a sectoral question in terms of, for Richard, are there maybe specific sectors that maybe government or policy can focus on that might be more vulnerable to the switch to digital consumption?
So in terms of the literature, there are kind of key identified groups based on kind of socio-economic status, age. There's also quite a lot of great research around kind of gender effects as well. in this area. I think the most pressing thing at the moment is that people are being forced online through this kind of digital by default system. They're being forced online to access education, they're being forced online to access services and kind of shopping as well, consumption. And part of the kind of battle to get them online really does rush through some of the concerns. So one of the concerns that you'll see in the literature, and quite a valid concern, is people having concerns or fears about their data, their privacy, when they're going online. Too often, that seems just to me that those concerns are brushed away in the battle to hit that inclusion figure. So I don't think, I think the kind of sector issue is really important, but at the moment, I think the urgency is the thing that needs really looking at.
Thank you very much, Richard. Just conscious of the time, I'll just finish up by thanking all of our presenters today. It's been excellent, and the session will be recorded so people can watch back. I think it was worth it for the rich discussion. Just to finish up and really echo Duncan's point, and again, I've made it in my work, that two separate debates. I think we need to stop. We need to stop the, thinking of productivity just in terms of the efficiency argument, and get back to why do we want to improve productivity, move it beyond a technical definition to the potential benefits for wider society and for the wider economy and wider societal benefits. And as we said, really think about who is benefiting from the productivity improvements, that distribution, where the productivity is created and who benefits from it as well. But I think that's great. And I think today, we've done our bit in bringing the conversation together. So thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers, all the participants, and for all your questions. And on behalf of the Productivity Insights Network, thank you.
Yeah.